Welcome everyone to ACDE number 216. Two main things on the agenda today. So first, updates on Fusaka and discussing where things are at, but also how we should approach trying to time the fork, and especially in light of like the process we discussed after Petra going live. So we can discuss this, and then there's a couple minor spec things as well. Then I wanted to at least open up the conversation around Glamsterdam. We said we would spend the next two ACDs discussing on this. All of the teams have shared their preferences already, at least on the EL side. So we can review that and then also figure out like, okay, what are the most important questions we need to answer in these next two calls? Whose input do we perhaps want to solicit beyond just core devs? And then, yeah, take it from there. But yeah, to kick us off, this Panda Ops want to give an update on the Fusaka devnets.
Sure, I can give a quick update. We have Fusaka devnet 2 running now for almost 2 weeks. We had a very stable week this week. We have a few bugs, most of them coming from consensus layer clients. So we have a lighthouse bug regarding the CGC value. They set a wrong CGC value in their ENR, and the metadata field is showing the right one. So there's some mismatch there. There's a lodestar bug where it is doing excessive polling and getting banned by different peers. Teku boot node was crashing due to it being overloaded by requests. Basically, too much requests is going into the database, and it was unable to keep up to head. They have a bug in the R builder right now, still working on the rebase from the REST side. And ideally, we can get the MEV workflow working by end of this week. Smaller issues. Luster and Teku are waiting for a finalized Genesis validator. So basically, when you start up a new network, they are going to wait for the first epoch to finalize before they update their CGC value, which is the wrong behavior. Prism metadata field is missing, and the blob schedule for Lighthouse is in descending order instead of ascending order. And there seems to be a Lighthouse memory leak for always prepare payload flag for trying to build all the blocks in the MEV workflow. And for Prism, the blob schedule is still missing from the spec beacon API. That's about it.
Thank you. Any client teams have anything they want to add to this? Oh, Prism has a PR to fix that issue about the blob schedule. Terence said in the chat. Any other comments, thoughts from devnet, or sorry, from client teams about devnets? Okay, and I know we already had a rough spec for devnet 3, but I guess what I did want to bring up before that is the overall timeline for Petra, for Fusaka, because after Petra, or when we rolled out Petra, there were a couple concerns. So first of all, some teams in the ecosystem, notably I think a couple of the L2 teams, said they would like to see a longer delay between the last release going on to mainnet and the actual fork, so at least 30 days there. And then the other thing that came up was that on the EF security side, and other people too, but mostly EF security, to have a longer window between the actual client releases that go live on testnets and the first testnet fork in order to do things like have security audits or raise the bug bounty and bring people's attention to these release. So Frederick had drafted like a process for the upgrade that included a 30-day window at both of those steps in the hard fork process. And we discussed this a few months ago. So assuming we followed that, and then everyone says we want to ship Fusaka this year. Historically, trying to ship before the big conference at the end of the year has worked better than after because one, there's work to do when we ship the fork, and two, after that, you quickly fall into the holidays. So assuming we wanted to ship before DevConnect this year, this means we'd want Mainnet to happen early-ish November. If you work backwards from that, it means that we would have to have client releases sometimes late August. And I know that Alex also had like a shorter proposal in terms of the schedule. But even that basically had the client releases come for the first testnet around early September. So I think regardless of like the specific rollout schedule that we have, if we want a good chance to like ship before DevConnect, if we want a good chance to ship before DevConnect, like we should at least aim to be in a spot where we're able to start forking testnets at the end of August, or sorry, have releases for the testnets at the end of August, maybe early September. And I think this also implies some decisions about the scope of the fork. So for example, whether or not we keep 7907 in, as there's been like a bunch of complications with that EIP. But yeah, I'll pause here. I guess I'm curious to hear from client teams. Like, first of all, do you think it's, a realistic timeline that like, yeah, if we have these releases in say late August, early September, then we'd be in a spot to ship in November. And then assuming that's correct, like what would we need to do to get there? Like, is that possible? Should we change the scope? Are there other things we should be considering if we wanted to hit that? Okay, so maybe another version of this question is if we said we're aiming, if we said we're aiming for client releases for say, the first testnet late August, like does any client think this is not possible? And then there's a point here around pure DAS testing. So I don't know, does anyone on the pure DAS side want to give some context there and like what they would see as the ideal testing schedule?
I
Me,
think,
Sorry, go on.
yeah, I think at the very least, we're going to need at least stable DevNet 3 and no spec changes after that other than clarifications. We're going to need a large network, collaborative probably with Sunnyside Labs, a non-finality network, mainnet and testnet shadow forks, a test without getblobs v2, as Dustin mentioned. And we have to run the analyses for what BPO values we actually want to set, both on the devnets as well, both for the testnets as well as on mainnet. And I think this is apart from audits and having all the client changes pushed into branches that are mostly stable. At least from the testing side, this is the stuff we see. And I think the testing team also has their own list of EIPs, etc., that they want to test. So yeah, the concrete ask would be how quickly can we get to DevNet 3? Because I think that's the at least first step where we can freeze the spec and everything else can start kicking off.
Okay, and I guess on the EL side, as I understand it, the biggest piece of work left, or like I don't know, uncertainty with regards to DevNet 3 is EIP 7907, so the code size limit increase. It seems like there's still many unresolved questions, and we've been looking at it for basically a month now post interop. So yeah, would it accelerate things to remove 7907 from Fusaka? And are there other things that we could do that would accelerate?
I think with regard to 7907, dropping it may be prudent at the time. It would definitely accelerate things. And also it would not slow things down, meaning that there are additional unknowns that we are going to unearth as we start testing 7907. And I can't see any of those speeding us up.
I agree with Justin from Nethermind's side.
I don't really want to speak for the guest team, but my feeling is also that 7907 introduces so many new edge cases, and we don't know how the future will look like regarding what we do with the contract size. We only know that this mechanism will not be the final mechanism, because it just doesn't work in this way. And so I believe we should rather than working on this quick fix, we should work on the final mechanism. Yeah, just because I think it's just we still don't know yet, and I think at this point we should know. And we gave this EIP and the EIP authors basically 2 months to figure out whether we should put it, whether we can figure out all of the edge cases. And in my opinion, we haven't figured that out yet. So,
thanks, Roman.
Reth's point of view is that the biggest source of contention on this EIP is the pricing adjustments, and people not feeling comfortable that this would be the final formula for calculating the code size load. So our opinion is that we morph the 7907 into the variant that was proposed during Berlin interop, which is a plain code size increase by anywhere around 25 to 50% from what it is today, and call it a day.
Okay, Ben?
Yeah, I was going to sort of second that one and ask if it was too late to, because I think it would be a bit disappointing if we didn't have any increase in code size. And that's a much simpler change.
Right. Derek?
Hey, so I'm Derek from representing kind of off-chain labs and Arbitrum. Specifically, we would definitely love to see an increase of any kind here. I'm curious if to hear from folks if the concerns kind of apply also to that modified approach of just raising it by 50% and calling it a day, as Roman described previously. And if the concerns there are alleviated or at least mitigated, this would be where we would love to see it be implemented here.
So I guess one question I would have, if for like the naive just raise it by 50% approach, is like, how does this affect performance, and especially at like higher gas limits? Is this like, I assume there were some reasons why the limit was set this way. So like, yeah, I don't have an intuition for what sort of wiggle room or buffer that we have. Ansgar?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem, that's also the problem with 7907, is that we just don't have really good benchmarks yet on this. Not just the changes, but also just the situation today and how that would just change with higher gas limits. I think from people looking into it, I think maybe Marius has looked into it a bit, and it looked like it's not actually super close to being an issue right now. So like the intuition, but again, the not yet super sustained intuition is that we would have a bit of room. And so of course, the very simple logic here is that the smaller the bump, the less likely that we will regret it, basically. So I think Julius EIP right now, I can link it in chat as well, by the way. It proposed an increase from 24 to 32, which is of course less than 50%. So I think the chance that ends up being something we regret or that blocks us from going to 100 million gas or something, I think is very small. But of course, it's also not that helpful for developers. And so the further up we would go, the higher the likelihood that it becomes a binding kind of strict scaling constraint. But of course, also the more useful it would become.
Got it. Charles?
Hello, I'm one of the EIP authors. I wanted to point out that the concern about how much code you can load in a block is actually worse if you bump the code size by 30 or 50% or whatever, because for 2600 gas, you can now load more code basically per unit of gas, whereas 7907 is much more strict in terms of how much code you can load per unit of gas.
Right. So I guess, yeah, to Justin's comment, like if the reason we're doing this is to speed up Fusaka and there's still some uncertainty, even with like a small bump, which will take time to like test and review, I would lean towards just removing 7907 and not changing the contract code size in this fork, and then figuring out like the quote unquote right way to do it for Glamsterdam. It would be pretty bad if we I don't know, agreed that like a 30% bump or 50% bump is fine now, and then 2 weeks before Pure DAS goes live, someone highlights some DOS issue that we missed. So yeah, it feels like we all wanted to do 7907. It's just taking longer than we expected to. So we should consider it for Glamsterdam. But if we want to speed up Fusaka, doing nothing will probably be the quickest.
I just wanted to say that it's not going to get considered for Glamsterdam because there's so many other things. And if we're going to quote unquote do it correctly, it's going to be a pretty large change. And that was like what a lot of the motivation for 7907 was that it's not going to happen for Glamsterdam. It probably won't happen after Glamsterdam. So let's try and do something now. And I'm not saying that, we've had a lot of time. It's still unclear. Maybe it's good to just take it out. But like, if we take it out, it's not going to Glamsterdam. That's almost certain.
Because you think that like, I don't know, if we do like block access list or FOCIL or ePBS, it'll just be too much to do this at the same time, or?
I mean, to do it right, it seems that most people think that code chunking is the right thing to do, the forward future compatible thing, and that's going to be big.
I see, yeah.
And so the way I think about a lot of these changes is that code chunking is a 5-year-old proposal. It seems like the right idea to do at some point in the future, but the future is uncertain.
Yeah.
And, people really want larger contract code sizes. I get it. Fusaka is getting delayed by these decisions now, so it's probably the right thing to do to just drop it. But like, I want to make sure that we're clear that if we drop it, the contract code size is not going to change for potentially years.
Thank you. Derek? And then to Derek and then Charles.
Sure, thanks. I just want to like huge +1 behind what like client just shared. This is our concern as well, and we genuinely believe that this increase would help developers a lot. Sounds like there's little to no appetite for delaying Fusaka as it is to even have some sort of or form of 7907. But we feel strongly that like this is a huge benefit if we can include it, to include it now.
And I guess, Derek, there was a question in the chat. Do L2s want more blobs sooner or bigger contract sizes? So you're saying you would rather have less blobs. Yeah, the blobs coming in at a later time than this. POTUS?
Yeah, so I don't really understand the issue with Arbitrum, but from the little I understand, it seems to me that what they need would be 7907 without any changes on L1. That would make it easier for them to maintain an increase on L2, which is what I suspect what they actually need. I don't understand why L2s would actually care about increasing the current contract limits on L1. And if it's no changes on L1, perhaps that's doable and that's less dangerous for us.
Ansgar?
Yeah, that's always the problem with EVM equivalence, though. Like, you can't really make changes on L2 because then if the L1 ever changes, which sounds like we will at some point do, then you're basically out of sync, and then you have to find a migration path to bring the L2 back into sync with how the L1 handles things, and it becomes a huge mess. So that's why generally L2s are very, very reluctant to ever make such changes on their own.
Charles?
Yeah, I wanted to point out another approach is shipping 7907 with an even smaller limit, such as it's already been reduced to 48 kilobytes from the original 256 kilobytes, and it could be shipped with maybe a 32 kilobyte limit or something like this. And as for shipping 7907 without increases, I think that's a little weird because you don't know, it's like a code path that's untested, or like it's a dead code path in production. So it might be very easy to have like consensus issues.
And would that make people feel more confident about 7907 if we reduced it to 32? Yeah. Okay, Roman. Yeah, Roman says no, and Ansgar as well. Like, yeah, my sense is like the complexity of the mechanism. That's the main bottleneck. Yeah, so I guess we should assume if we do remove it, we can obviously propose it for Glamsterdam, but the odds of it being accepted are uncertain. So we should be fine with, not having it go live for some period of time. I guess the question is like, yeah, do client teams think that it's worth removing this to make sure we get the ship Fusaka slightly quicker? And I think Beizhu and Nethermind originally said they would rather drop it. Yeah. Yeah, Charles.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious from the client teams or the leads or whoever's opposed to this, like what exactly they would want to see in order for it to be okay to go in. I know code chunking has been discussed, but there isn't really a finalized EIP as far as I know. And if we know what the blockers are for this getting in, then either for Fusaka or Glamsterdam, I think it would be really good to have more clarity.
I think the problem is we don't know. Like, I have a list of stuff that I would like to see, and Jochen has been working on it. But those are just the things that I thought of, and I don't know. The more I think about it, the list grows longer and longer about edge cases, and I think my biggest argument right now is that, the biggest argument that I see right now is that this mechanism is not future compatible, so we will need to change the mechanism anyway. And yeah, I don't know if we should enshrine this mechanism for potentially 1 or 2 hard forks when we can either get the benefit with something very simple or go for the full proposal that will be future proof in the ZK EVM world.
Okay. And I guess maybe one other data point. So Ansgar asked in the chat how people feel about it and the emoji react. Most of the responses would remove it, but like notably, it seems like pretty much all of the testing team is in favor of removing this, I assume due to the bandwidth it would take. And the biggest issue we have with PeerDAS is like, our lack of testing and focus on that. I think based on that, I would lean towards removing it and not making another change so that we can actually focus on shipping PeerDAS. We can obviously have the conversation of like exactly what we want to see and which benchmarks we want for Glamsterdam, but given like testing is on the critical path at this point, and at least like a decent subset of the client teams or client devs want to remove it, I would lean towards just removing 7907, not doing any variant of it in this fork, and yeah, trying to make sure we can move to a spec freeze and testing Fusaka as quickly as possible. And the implication is, yes, we can repropose this for Glamsterdam, but it's either we would need to include code chunking, which is a significant lift, or have some better benchmark on a simpler proposal. But there's definitely no guarantee that it would go in. So yeah, last call, but I think we should just move forward, remove 7907 from Fusaka. Okay, so remove 7907. This changes the spec obviously for DevNet 3. The other quick thing I wanted to flag in terms of the spec is that we also merged this PR to reduce the maximum transaction size. And then I think this is basically the final-ish list of things for DevNet 3. Let me pull up, Barnabas shared the link a bit earlier. Sorry, I can't find the link, but oh, okay, I'll repost it at the bottom of the chat. It was quite far. Oh, thank you. So given this, if we don't have 7907, and then there's some updates to PeerDAS, the gas limit cap, to a couple of the EIPs, how the clients feel about timelines for DevNet 3 is it something we still think we can is it something we still think we can deploy next week? Yeah, 23rd of July. Do people think is this realistic for DevNet 3 without 7907? Okay, we have some thumbs up, so we'll have at least some clients on DevNet 3. Great. So let's aim for that. And then we were kind of out of order here, but I think it's also worth directly talking about like the rollout schedule for Fusaka to make sure we're all on the same page. Again, like when we shipped Pectra and there were these issues, we came up with this proposal where we wanted to have 30 days both before the first testnet and after the last testnet before mainnet. There's definitely been some pushback on this in the coming week. So I think maybe a good place to start is, I don't know, Frederick, if you want to like give a bit more context around why we decided on those numbers and like why it's important, and then we can see if we want to stick to them or change, or if people have concerns.
Yeah, so we had the Hodeshki incident, which kind of initiated this whole process to start thinking about how we should be planning the hard forks. The reason we picked 30 days between the client release and the first testnet was basically to give enough time to have audit competitions. We wanted to have the ability to have people reviewing the final code bases, both internally and externally, and yeah, doing it in 2 weeks is quite tight, especially if something is found towards the end of it. So that's why we picked 30 days between the first client release and the testnet. The other thing for the 30 days between the last testnet and mainnet was basically because we wanted to be sure that we had enough time to verify that everything was actually working as intended, so that after, like, if we would have done a mainnet release 2 weeks after the last testnet and then something didn't really pop out immediately, then that could have effects on the mainnet and, you know, potentially end up with downtime or similar. So the reasoning is we just want some extra security to do that. And then, as you mentioned earlier in the call, there's been other L2s and such that's also expressed a desire to have 30 days so that they can have enough time to implement stuff on their side for the hard forks.
Thank you. One question I think this raises is what's the level of finality that we want on the testnet releases? Because obviously, if we assume that we want the testnet releases to be as close as possible to the mainnet release, then we should almost have a much higher bar for that, and then assume that like maybe the path between the last testnet and mainnet is a bit shorter. On the other hand, if we assume that maybe it's fine if the first testnet release is not as final as, say, the mainnet release, it may be fine to have a bit less time between like that release and the testnet because we're still testing.
I think it depends a bit on how we see the testnets. Like if we're okay with them breaking, like it happened on Leshki, then I think we could shorten the time. We could probably do 2 weeks if that's the case. Because if it ends up breaking and we don't really worry too much about that on the testnet, then that seems like a reasonable time frame. But if we want to ensure that the testnets are up and running and we don't have the same incident.
That we got from the community at least is that we're not supposed to break testnets.
Yeah, that's so. In that case, we should be doing our best to minimize that risk. From a change point of view, I will, like when we've done these audits and the competitions in the past, there's been findings, and we obviously clients are updating, but I would expect that there aren't like massive changes between the release candidate and the first testnet, but it's primarily things like fixes.
Right. So I guess like yes, the bounding constraint is almost like when do we want to have a client release that's ready for like a proper security review, and then we assume that some clients will have some bugs through that process, and obviously we don't want that to happen on mainnet. And I guess, and so I guess like yes, the maybe the difference here is like you want the release that's like stable and you think works for the first test nets, but you also want time to like get bugs. So like why should we just start basically the should we basically just start the security reviews on the first testnet release? Would that like buy us some time? And then if we find some like weird edge case, hopefully it doesn't bring down an entire testnet. But like the issues we found on like Holeshki last time were not like security. Were not outcomes of the security reviews. They were more like configuration issues. Whereas, as I understand it, a lot of the security review stuff found, pretty pretty unique edge cases that would require some amount of like ingenuity to exploit. So I don't know, is it reasonable to say like we have perhaps a shorter path to the test nets? We assume the releases on the test nets are stable. We then do like a thorough security review of them, and we want to have a longish period of time for that before we actually have the mainnet release.
I mean, it will increase the risk of something happening on the testnets. I mean, that's the only thing. Like there were consensus issues and other things that were found. I don't know about the likelihood of someone exploiting that on the testnet to cause issues, etc. But obviously, things can be found that could have an impact on the testnets.
Obviously, you don't have 100% certainty, but
no. I mean, the idea would be that we start the audit competition on the day that the clients have a release candidate for the first testnet out. That's the current plan, and probably run it for 4 weeks. Obviously, that could work still if the testnet is launched after 2 weeks. It just means that there will be a 2-week period where the competition is still running. So people will have time to find issues. The kind of hard thing here is that these changes are quite complex. So it usually takes a few weeks for people to kind of wrap their head around the changes and start finding issues. But again, if it's...
Is there a way, can we just announce it before? So like, I imagine that, in the 2 weeks before the competition starts, clients have code that's like pretty close to what will be in their final releases. Obviously, they might still be fixing some issues. But in a way, it's like, could you get people to start reviewing, and then, this sort of previous release with the expectation that like only the testnet release is in scope for the bug bounty, because obviously if they're fixing bugs before the like testnet release.
I mean the announcement about the competition and guides and stuff will be released earlier. So some people will probably do it. The other thing that we're doing is that we're opening up the bug bounty program ahead of time once things are seen as ready. So once the spec is finalized, for example, that will be in scope of the bug bounty program. Once client X has completed their implementation of feature Y, then that will be in scope. So that will be updated. So we will have quite a few features in the bug bounty program ahead of the first official client release. So that I think that would also help with finding issues early on.
Okay. I see Solid's up for a while.
Yeah, so I already wrote that on the chat, but wanted to raise this that I think we have a quite unique situation with the testnets now with Holeshki, which is kind of still fully functioning, but at the same time is going to be sunset quite soon. So my idea would be maybe it really makes sense to try to do a Holesky upgrade, Fusaka Holesky upgrade as fast as soon as possible. And you know, if I mean, it will be a very good indication how ready we are for the serious deployment of Fusaka. So I mean, if something not good happens, then well, anyway, this testnet is going to be to sunset quite soon.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Like we should definitely deploy the Holeshki and see if there's any issues. I don't know if we even need to treat it as like a public testnet. Like we can, like, I mean, if we need like a full announcement and all of that, given there's not that many users. But the timeline could be quite quick here. I guess the one thing none of this kind of changes is like, yeah, to the extent we want to do a lot of testing, potentially an extra testnet, I think it means we have to have the client releases for the first testnets out sometime late August, early September. Is this like somewhat realistic if we freeze the scope now? And what do we need to do, in the meantime to make this happen? Because there's a lot we can chat about the specifics of PeerDAS on next week's call too, but is that just the main thing is focusing on PeerDAS testing? Is there anything else specifically on the EL side that we should be doing over the next month or two? Okay, so this seems to be mostly a CL testing thing. And on the EL, we removed the most problematic EAP. So I think we can wrap this up. We don't have to obviously set the dates today. That wasn't quite the intention, but more to like highlight that pretty much independent of the specifics of like the ordering of testnets and whatnot. If we want to ship sometime in November, then we have about a month and a half to 2 months to get to a spot where we're forking the testnets, and that should be how we're thinking about it. Anything else on Fusaka that people wanted to discuss? Okay, then next up, Glamsterdam. So we agreed last time that the next 2 calls on the EL side following this one would be the calls where we try to figure out the headliner for Glamsterdam. Most, if not all, of the client teams have shared their preferences in the past week or so. So I think it might be helpful to get at least on the EL side an overview of the different teams. And then try to highlight like, okay, for the most likely headliners, what do we want to figure out in the next couple of weeks? Block level access lists and FOCIL seem like the 2 biggest ones that have come up repeatedly. Obviously, ePBS is quite popular, but I think that's been, or that's obviously mostly a CL thing, so we don't have to focus on this too much here. But yeah, I guess from the different EL teams, it would be good to hear like, what do you think? Oh, and sorry, POTUS, I don't mean that like, I don't mean that ePBS should not be the headliner, but more that like it's mostly a CL EIP, and I don't think there's any work on the EL. So I want to make sure that like we zoom into the preferences on the EL side. Yeah. And then next week, obviously, we can discuss ePBS in depth on the CL call. But yes, the 2 that come up consistently are block level access list and FOCIL on EL side. And yeah, I guess it would be good to hear from different teams, like why they feel this way about headliners, and then if there's uncertainty or things that they still want to figure out, what are those and how can we answer them in the next month or so. Are there specific people that we want to wave in, parts of the community? Are there some other discussions we should have or schedule? Yeah. And Ben?
Yeah, a block level access list is the most aligned to the strategic focus of Glamsterdam in terms of scaling the L1.
Okay, thank you. Roman?
One thing that I would like to be figured out additionally for a block level access list, if it is possible not to keep them around for a long time, like for clients just to use it for a month or two worth of recent blocks, because otherwise it's just still data that.
You mean like we could prune them like the blobs, basically?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Does anyone have like a quick take on that, or otherwise we can sort this out, I think, but it is an important question.
Yeah, if we maintain a block level access list as root in some way, then they can always be rebuilt by rerunning the blocks. So therefore they could be trimmed.
Okay.
Do we think that history expiry covers this?
It's a different time scale though, right? Like history expiry, like now is pre-merge, and maybe we'll get to like a rolling window, but we're not there yet. So
That's specifically what I mean, is the rolling window.
So you can think of keeping block access list in the history if you want to keep them forever anyway. It would be equivalent of keeping archive node in history, right? In a way. So basically you're running an archive node from the point of block access list being added. So I'm also for trimming it.
Ansgar?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight, said that in chat, that I think if we, to the extent that we agree that scaling is the kind of the theme on the EL side for Glamsterdam, which I think, I mean, FOCIL is a bit of a special topic. We can talk a bit about FOCIL, but other than that, I think people broadly seem to roughly agree on this. And then I think headliners, in a sense, are less of a clear-cut fit on the EL side. Yes, I think block level access list, we decided to make it a headliner. Maybe it can be a combined headliner with something on the CL side or so, but I think that's a bit more of a stand-in. It's clearly a smaller feature. I think it's going to be great for scaling, but I think even more crucial through scaling on the L side will be repricing. Like you can imagine, if we ship just block level access lists, but we don't change the price relative to, say, data, then we can't scale more at all. It won't give us any more headroom because like block level access lists don't help with data, right? So basically now data would just be the bottleneck. So clearly block level access list already needs to come with some sort of repricing to even make any use of it for scaling. But more so, like I think basically there needs to be like this broad repricing effort. There's already a lot of work ongoing on this, but across compute, across state, across data, like that also requires a lot of much more rigorous benchmarking. All of this is ramping up in the background, but I think the headliners here really are not the ideal instrument to express that, because if I think about like what in my mind would make it worth delaying Glamsterdam, like in a way I wouldn't even care about block level access lists. If that for some reason takes more time, we can always push it. Like we could not ship Glamsterdam without repricings, because otherwise we're basically just completely capped in terms of scaling. So just wanted to say, repricing is obviously not a headliner, but it's, I think, to me, at the very core of scaling on the EL for Glamsterdam.
Great, thank you. Justin?
Yeah, I think I want to challenge a little bit of what Ansgar said with regard to having different headliners for the EL and the CL. I'm not sure that's a thematic approach we want to take. There will inherently be conflicts there. We think that censorship resistance is perfectly fine for a headlining theme across both layers and still accommodates pursuing scale via block access lists. And there are a number of scaling improvements that you get with things like ePBS. I would want us to think a little bit more deeply about, having split themes and split headline intents, if you will, across the different layers. I don't think that these are mutually exclusive, and I also think that maybe we should take a deeper look over the next week with regard to some of these code chunking ideas as well. I know that we are planning 2 weeks to consider headliners, and if the contract size thing remains an issue that folks are concerned about since it's being dropped, then we should accommodate that.
I guess one question, maybe Ansgar's question is, you say you don't want 2 headliners, but then you say you want ePBS and FOCIL.
No. I said I didn't want 2 themes. And to me, ePBS and FOCIL are very much the same theme.
Okay. Roman?
Yeah, I wanted to voice support for what Ansgar said. In our view on Glamsterdam headliners, we mentioned that having balls as a headliner for EL is a little bit underwhelming because it is a high impact change, but it feels like it requires much less work than the headline bar. So we would like to see something else be bundled alongside balls on the execution layer, and maybe gas repricing is that.
Yeah, and obviously we can do more EIPs between that, but I think it's important to say this is the main thing, and it's true that block access lists are maybe not as they're clearly not as big as something like ePBS. Let's do Justin and then Ben.
I'd just like to highlight, well, one, block level access list by itself isn't necessarily that big, but making use of it and doing the parallelism, doing improved syncing, it becomes bigger. However, even though it's CL, I'd like to highlight, ePBS and variants like it are quite important because all of the EL changes, essentially, from FOCIL to balls to even resource repricing, would all imply larger blocks. So there we go.
Thanks.
One thing about BALs, if I can chime in, is that Camille was doing some testing on the bloatnet, state bloatnet, and at some point with very big state and head blocks are very they were modifying the state, using all the gas to modify the state. At some point, I don't know the exact details, clients started to have problems with healing when they were syncing, because each block would change the tree so much that they had problems with healing, and balls would help here definitely, because all that data would have to be discovered. It could be just taken from the access lists. So there's a scaling limit with SnapSync healing, which we will potentially hit at some point, at least at the edge case, and this could be a remedy.
Okay. So I guess one thing that the block access list needs is just more research on the dropping them. We should figure out if we do want a code chunking, or if we do want a code chunking or contract repricing headliner proposal. This is something that someone should put together in the next 2 weeks. We are already past the headliner deadline, but if CoreDevs feel this is important, then we definitely need someone to like own that. Does anyone want to volunteer for this?
So I asked this question in chat, and it was a little bit crickets of a response, but can anyone post links to the current code chunking designs, if any? I think that's going to inform whether or not this is even a viable to EIP.
Okay. Okay, then there's a comment by Sophia saying that like for ZKVM, in terms of scaling, the hard requirements are either ePBS or delayed execution in Glamsterdam. I guess, okay, so we heard, actually, yeah, Aragon, I think, has like some fairly different opinions from other teams on the headliners. I don't know if anyone from Aragon wants to give their perspective there.
Well, on the CL side, we still think ePBS is going to be a little bit controversial from decentralization point of view, but that's like a debate. But from EL side, it's clear to us that block level access lists are going to be the kind of headliner, and of course, just implementing the specs of it is not the end of the game. You'll also have to supplement that with implementations of parallel execution that supports it. So we'll be focusing on that. As the headliner, of course, there are going to be, and I expect them to be, more EIPs supplementing scaling and other targets that we have.
Okay, do any of the client teams have other opinions they want to share? We kind of didn't go through the list super cleanly, but yeah. Any other teams have a strong opinion? Okay, actually, yeah, Ansgar has a question in the chat around FOCIL. So I think FOCIL is a bit of a tricky one where it's not clear if it's an EL or CL topic. It obviously involves both. I think it's something that a good chunk of the teams felt was like, if not a like #1 priority, at least something that should be like considered as a stretch goal or for the next fork. My vibe space intuition here is that like combining it with say ePBS in a single fork is probably too much, but how the client teams think about this, like the relationship between FOCIL, ePBS, and potentially some of the other EL EIPs around scaling, like block access lists or repricing. Yeah, Aman. And then Roman.
Yeah, so the Nethermind team feels that FOCIL should only be implemented after or alongside ePBS, as like doing the restructuring and the bandwidth expansion is kind of a prerequisite, kind of like not really prerequisite, but like it makes more sense to do the restructuring and bandwidth expansion before implementing FOCIL and BALS as well.
Okay, Roman.
I just wanted to say that we wanted to put FOCIL as a stretch goal, and it is upon CL teams to evaluate whether they can fit both ePBS and FOCIL within the same fork, and whether it's feasible for us to ship both.
Yeah, Police.
I wanted to mention if the discussion is about like how these EIPs interact, I think it should be very clear. I think it is clear, but let's just explicitly state it. But block level access list and ePBS don't even talk to each other. I don't really care how balls are implemented. I won't touch that code, and no one from the EL cares about how ePBS is implemented. We can code this in parallel. They don't talk to each other. The one thing that touches both sides is FOCIL, and FOCIL is heavy on the CL, not on the EL. It shouldn't have even been mentioned as an EL headliner. It's minor on the EL side, it's heavier on the CL side. Having said so, my personal opinion is what Barnabas said early on the call. We can easily now, it seems that there's broad support. We could easily agree on trying to schedule for balls and ePBS and actually CFI FOCIL that has broad support. I personally believe that it's doable. I'm not sure if it's doable, but I believe it to be true. That's going to take time after rebasing and actually looking at implementations.
Yeah, and yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like the block access list conversation is like pretty separate from ePBS. It matters obviously whether or not we do ePBS in the grand scheme of things. And then yes, FOCIL does feel big enough that there's high uncertainty whether this could all be like bundled in a single fork. So we can have that conversation maybe in more depth on the CL call next week. At the very least, we should agree on a prioritization between them. But I think, like, yeah, we need to decide, like, okay, if we had to choose between these two, which one are we going to ship? And from the client team's perspective, so far it seems like ePBS is the bigger priority. But maybe the solution there is like, yeah, FOCIL is just like a vanilla EIP. It's not necessarily a headliner, but it does feel. It does feel like FOCIL is big enough that it warrants like that level. And historically, we've just been very bad at trying to do two big changes on one layer at the same time. And maybe we should just like ship ePBS as soon as we can, ship block access lists or repricings or whatnot as soon as we can, and then have FOCIL in the next fork if that's what people feel strongly about. But we can have that conversation, I guess, on the CL call next week. Maybe one other thing I would like to look into is this idea around like scaling as a headliner and block access lists and repricings being maybe like only components to it on the EL side. We get Thomas, if you want to go, we can do your FOCIL comments and then. Yeah.
A bit about FOCIL, but more generally, I don't really understand the sort of policy around not being able to submit a headliner as a vanilla EIP. Like it feels like, maybe people agree that FOCIL, for example, is too big for being like a vanilla EIP, but like generally, I don't think like the rule is like a good one, just because it's basically you are a headliner if you took the time to go on like if magicians and write a post about it, but like it doesn't inform anything about the complexity of implementing it or how well it fits with other EIPs or anything else.
I think most headliners are actually quite complex, and maybe some of them are like on the line, and this is the first time we do this, so it's a bit, there's like some uncertainty. Block access list to me feels more like that, where it's like, it's like a big EIP, but it's, if you compare it to things we've historically centered forks around, like whether it's 4844 or PureDAS or 1559, like it's block access list feels like much smaller. And I don't know, maybe FOCIL is right at the limit where it's like a small headliner or a big EIP, and it's a tricky edge case. But then if you look at something like, ePBS, then that's clearly big enough that like we can't do like ePBS and say shorter slot times in a single fork. Like both of those are pretty huge, and yeah, historically we would just waste more time trying to merge them than to like do one after the other. So I think it's important to all agree, like what is the most important thing we want in this hard fork. Potentially those things are separate on the layers because they don't interact. So I think it's fine to have a headliner per layer. We don't necessarily need to, but saying like, ePBS is the most important thing on the CL, and then block access list or something else is the most important thing on the EL. And they really don't interact. That seems reasonable. But I really want, like, we need to make a decision about what our actual priority is in the next fork. And then, sorry, when I say, I guess, the Ansgar's comment is, part of this is also when do we want the fork to ship? Like, to the extent we want to have quicker forks, which is something that's come up a lot in the past, then we should just reduce the scope as much as possible. Yeah. Ben?
I think what you said of like a meta, maybe a meta EIP would make sense, where we put block level access lists in there. But there are many other things we already know that we want to do. So some additional repricings on precompiles and all that sort of stuff, and they would all fit under that same bracket.
Tony?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I wouldn't underestimate the work that has to go into block level access lists, because of course the in-protocol implementation might be quite trivial, but then you need to actually use them for parallelization. You need to actually use them for parallelizing between execution and the post state updates. Then you might want to use them for snap sync. So there are many different things that come after the protocol implementation, and clients might need time to actually make use from them.
But Tony, clients don't have to make use of it ASAP. They can adapt it on their own schedule. So that's why, like, it's not consensus features. So we don't have to care them at the fork time.
Yeah, totally agree. That's quite nice. But still, if you want to use them for scaling, clients at some point need to kind of make use of them. And in the end, we do them for scaling. So at some point, we expect clients to actually use them.
Yes, but for example, clients can roll them out between the fork and the next version, right? So they have more time to test it and to polish it.
At the very least, though, we'd have to verify that the block level access lists are correct and reject the block if they're not.
And generate them during block production.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess one other question, like, yeah, that we should think about before the next call is, what do we want the timing of the next fork to be? And this will inform the scope. Obviously, we can't know it like perfectly in advance, but like, yes, to the extent we want to have smaller forks, then we should keep the scope as tight as possible. If we're fine having longer forks, then we can obviously add more things, but I think this should kind of play into to what extent we're willing to accommodate more features. One other thing we haven't touched on yet is just outside of client devs, like, who are groups that we would maybe want to see weigh in on things like FOCIL, ePBS, block access lists, or repricings if relevant. Like, are there people we should be bringing on these calls that, or getting their feedback before the next call? I guess Domsgar's comment, like that stakeholders want scaling, I guess. Yeah, like are there people, like specific stakeholders we think we should loop in? And it's fine if not, but yeah, this would be the time to start reaching out. Okay, so no strong opinions. And then, okay, the last thing maybe I wanted to propose is that, so we, we have these headliners. What do we want as a deadline for people to submit just like normal EIPs for the fork to do these proposals? Do we want to say that like the proposals for regular EIPs should end like when we select the headliner, when Fusaka goes live, some other time? How do people feel about this? I think historically, we've had proposals come in quite late in the process, so it's probably better to set a deadline that reflects reality than to like optimistically say, oh, we want them to all be there in August, and then in December of this year, we're still adding EIPs. But yeah, curious if people have strong opinions on this.
Is it realistic to say that the spec is frozen, as it were, at shipping time for the previous hard fork, Fusaka?
So by spec, you mean like the EIPs included?
Yep.
Okay. If we were to do that, then I would say it means all the small EIPs should be proposed by the date we choose the headliner, so that as soon as we're done with the headliner, we can review the other ones. And currently that would be August 21st, which is about a month from now. Anyone opposed to that?
I might be slightly, just because I'd rather focus on Fusaka and not have to also be thinking about these other EIPs.
Right. Yeah. So, I guess this. Yeah. So should
again,
the deadline?
Maybe this is fine, but if I think we have some breathing room, so just something to think about before we lock in a date.
One kind of weird compromise could be like the Fusaka testnet releases or the first Fusaka testnet fork or something. But yeah. And we don't have to settle this now, but as we finalize the headliner, we should be clear about what our deadline is. And then if we finalize the headliner 1 month and we haven't solved it in 1 month and we haven't solved this, then I think we can't say like, oh, now proposals are closed. Yeah. Okay. Maris is saying repricings will take more than 1 month to be finalized. So I think then, yeah, clearly it's not realistic to have the final proposals for the end of the headliner selection. So let's see how things go, and we can set a deadline a bit later on. And if people want to propose EIPs that are not headliner, just open a PR against the meta EIP for the fork and list it there. And once we're done with the headliner conversations, we will get back to that list. Barnabas?
If you want to ship a fork by, let's say, next year this time, then that means we actually need to get people to start looking into and working on ePBS and block level access list, at least one dev per client team. This is the exact same thing as what we did for PeerDAS, and that is why we are actually able to ship PeerDAS this year and not sometime next year. And the sooner we decide in what is actually going to go into Glamsterdam, the sooner we can actually get people to dedicate a specific person into this problem. And the sooner we can have Ball and ePBS devnets up and running parallel to Fusaka devnets. And I actually disagree with Stokes. I don't think we need every single person from every single team focusing on Fusaka, because that's counterproductive. What we need better prioritization, and we need more devnets. And basically, that's the only way we can ship faster.
I guess one question there is, do CL teams feel like next week on the call they could actually decide like to go with ePBS? If so, then think we're in a good spot, but it feels a bit weird to make a decision about the CL headliner now. But if we can agree to make the call for the CL headliner next week, then yeah, it feels a bit easier to then tell teams like you should have someone on this.
Yeah, I'd rather focus on devnet 3 for the next week or two until it's up and ready before opening that topic.
I mean, every single client team has made their blog post, and every single one of them clearly said that they want to do ePBS. So like,
I think Aragon is maybe the only one, and it's like an EL team. So I think every CL team has said ePBS, and the vast majority of EL teams, yeah.
Right, but we also said we wanted to bring on more community input, and so this is something we're working on, and that's just going to take some more time.
Yeah, so just wanted to say for Lighthouse, we put out a blog post that was Mark's opinion on ePBS, and I think a lot of the team feel similar to Mark, but we're not entirely on the same page. Like Lion mentioned in the chat, he's working on like a write-up on his point of view. And also, I just wanted to say, we've had Mark pretty much full-time on ePBS for a while, so I think other CL teams are probably in the same boat where we're already dedicating a fair amount of effort to it. And I don't think it's detracting from the pure desk development so far.
Yeah, Perry has a comment here that could be interesting. So like, sure, we can go ahead and signal the intent, but then have, again, maybe another period of a few weeks to get community input and see where that takes us.
Okay.
I do think go with that approach, we have to also figure out whose input we're looking at. I think Twitter sentiment doesn't really work. So whose actual input are we waiting for over the next couple of weeks? Who do we need to reach out to?
Well, I think it depends on the headliners, but for example, if we say ePBS is the headliner we want on the CL, then we can bring in all the different Mev players there. Anyone else we can think about who might be impacted.
Yeah, I think right now there's a strong signal for ePBS and block level access lists. So taking these two as a signal from the CL, I guess the next step is getting a signal from the community. So we should have a straight path from who these EIPs affect to who we need to talk to, right?
Yeah, I think for ePBS, it's pretty clear. For VALs, maybe less clear.
If I may interrupt, isn't there like a weird recursive relationship where we need to community input to decide the headliners, but we need like some soft commitment to the headliners to decide who in community to talk to?
I don't think that doesn't seem that crazy. Like I think like we've clearly narrowed down the set. There were like 9 or 10 things proposed as headliners last I checked. And now it's clear that on the CL side, ePBS is the main contender. FOCIL is something that a lot of people want to see, and there's some uncertainty, and then block level access lists feel like a no-brainer. So I think it's not like it is a bit of like a circular dependency, but you kind of shed part of the circle at each round or something. Yeah. And I do think the CL side is more complex here versus the EL side seems pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, I just strongly agree with Paritosh. Like, if we're delaying the decision because we need to talk to the community, we need to understand who in community to talk to.
Yeah, so I guess Alex, please.
Well, just a kind of a side comment, just to make that point a little clear, like Data Always was here in the chat saying, they're working on sort of their view of ePBS. And again, I think it's just kind of this thing where more information is better, It could be the case that there's some angle of perspective they see that helps us inform the design. And, you know, even downstream of like, do we do it or not? It's like you could imagine in both worlds, you know, just having more people look at the problem is probably going to lead to a better solution.
Yeah, and that plan as well.
Okay, so just to put it into words, we're just giving everybody time to give their input, given that all of the teams already published their opinions. So if people don't give input by the next ACDE, we assume that they're fine and we can make a final decision then. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would think so. Like, I think, you know, if we said we needed 2 calls and we end up making a decision on 1, that seems reasonable. But I do feel a bit uncomfortable saying like, we kind of signaled that we would make this decision, you know, not today, but 2 weeks from now and potentially 4 weeks from now. And if we kind of front run the community and we say, oh, like we just chose block access list, like it feels a bit off. And if on the EL side, if it's like so straightforward, then it shouldn't change in the next 2 weeks. And I think on the CL side, then we will benefit from having more people weigh in. And again, potentially after next week, we all feel like, okay, ePBS is still like the main thing and everyone's happy with it, then great, let's just commit to that. But I don't think that like I don't think that like we gain much by making like a hard commitment today, especially given where Fusaka is at. And again, if like things are still clear, then they should still be clear in 2 weeks. Yeah. I think that's all we had on the agenda. Anything else people wanted to bring up before we wrap up? Charles?
Hello. I just wanted to follow on the 7907 discussion I pasted in the chat. Basically, I had an alternative EIP 7903, which only touches the init code limit. And I was wondering if I could propose that as an alternative to 7907 for Fusaka because it's not as ideal, but it does give some of the same UX benefits because it allows you to deploy groups of contracts in a single transaction.
Unless every client team has like a full implementation already and the testing team has a full test suite, I don't think we should add anything to Fusaka at this point. I assume that's not the case for 7903, but if that's incorrect.
In some way, it's a stripped down version of 7907.
I'd be curious to hear from like testing and client teams, like, is this like trivially easy to do and something we want? Or I think if it adds any like complexity or uncertainty, we should not do it in Fusaka. Okay. 7903. Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's strong support or understanding, so I would lean against it.
Is it something that we could discuss on the next ACDT? At least people can take a look.
I think we're already like 7907 was already like the last minute extension that we did past the deadline as this like a final attempt to include something, and that turned out to be more complicated. But yeah, I don't think like trying to understand or add new EIPs at this point makes sense. Yeah. But yeah, obviously we can discuss it for Glamsterdam. But I think for Fusaka, we remove 7907 and call it a day. Anything else before we wrap up? Okay. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, let's get devnet 3 up. I'll update the meta EIP to remove 7907, and we can talk about the headliners some more next week on the CL call. Talk to y'all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.